What if the man who nearly killed you was the only one standing between you and death? Subscribe to this channel for stories that will leave you breathless with twists you'll never see coming. Hit that subscribe button because what happens next will shatter everything you thought you knew about revenge, justice, and the thin line between victim and survivor. The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed buzzed like angry wasps, and through the haze of morphine and broken ribs, I could hear him talking to the doctors with that voice he used for everyone else, that gentle, concerned husband voice that made strangers smile and nurses pat his shoulder sympathetically. While I lay there knowing the truth about those hands that now gripped the bed rail with such apparent worry. And I wanted to scream, wanting to tell them all that these same hands had wrapped around my throat just hours ago, squeezing until the world went black. But my jaw was wired shut from where his fist had connected with my face 3 days prior. And all I could do was watch him perform his Oscar-worthy act of the devoted spouse, terrified for his wife's well-being. And the doctor was saying something about internal bleeding and emergency surgery. And Marcus, my husband, the man who had systematically destroyed me for 5 years, was nodding with tears, actually tears streaming down his face as he held my hand. The same hand he had twisted until I heard bones crack just last week. And I felt the familiar numbness creeping in, not from the drugs, but from the years of learning to disappear inside myself, to float above my body and watch from a distance, as if all of this was happening to someone else, because that was the only way to survive. And the nurse was asking him to step outside while they prepped me for surgery, and he leaned down to kiss my forehead, whispering so only I could hear that if I said anything to anyone about what really happened, he would make sure I never wake up from the anesthesia, that he had connections, that he would find a way. And I believed him because Marcus always kept his promises, especially the dark ones. And as they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught a glimpse of him in the waiting area, on his phone, probably calling his mother to tell her about my unfortunate accident down the stairs, another lie to add to the collection of lies that had become my life. And I closed my eyes, trying to remember who I was before Marcus, before the first time he raised his hand, before I learned to measure my words and my steps and my breathing around his moods. And I was 23 when we met at that coffee shop where I worked double shifts to pay for nursing school. And he was so charming, so attentive, bringing me flowers and leaving sweet notes and telling me I was special, that he had never met anyone like me. And within 6 months, we were married because he said, when you know, you know. And I believed in fairy tales back then, believed that love conquered all, that his occasional jealousy was just proof of how much he cared. And the first time he hit me was on our honeymoon in Cancun because I smiled at the waiter, and he said I was disrespecting him, embarrassing him. And afterwards, he cried and begged for forgiveness and bought me an expensive bracelet and promised it would never happen again. And I believed him because I wanted to believe, because admitting the truth meant admitting I had made a catastrophic mistake. And then it happened again and again, each time followed by apologies and gifts until I stopped counting, until the violence became as routine as morning coffee. And I learned all the tricks, wearing long sleeves in summer, applying makeup to cover bruises, telling friends and family I was just clumsy, always falling, always walking into doors, always having accidents. And eventually, they stopped asking, stopped calling, stopped trying to reach me, because Marcus had isolated me so completely that I barely existed outside the prison of our home. And I quit nursing school because he said I didn't need to work, that his salary as a pharmaceutical sales rep was enough for both of us. But really, it was about control, about making sure I had no money, no independence, no way out. And yesterday had been the worst beating yet because I had committed the unforgivable sin of looking at our bank statements and discovering that he had been stealing from his company. And I asked him about it, asked if we were in trouble, and his face had transformed into something monstrous, and he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me across the kitchen floor. And when I tried to protect myself, he kicked me in the ribs, again and again. And I remembered thinking, this is it, this is how I die. And then everything went black. And when I woke up, I was in his car, and he was driving frantically to the hospital. And I realized with cold clarity that he wasn't taking me there to save me, he was taking me there to save himself. Because a dead wife in his house would mean questions, would mean investigations, would mean his carefully constructed image would crumble. And so here we were in this emergency room with him playing the role of concerned husband while my body screamed with every breath. And now, as the anesthesiologist placed a mask over my face and told me to count backwards from 10, I felt myself letting go, surrendering to the darkness. And maybe this was mercy. Maybe I wouldn't wake up. Maybe this nightmare would finally end. And I reached 8 in my counting when I saw her standing in the corner of the operating room, a woman in scrubs, but something was off about her. She was watching me with eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. And she moved toward me, and no one else seemed to notice her. And she leaned close and whispered that I had a choice, that I could let go or I could fight, that there was power in survival, power I didn't know I possessed. And I wanted to ask what she meant, but I was at 5 now, and the world was dissolving into fragments of light and sound. And her voice followed me into the void, telling me that Marcus had made a fatal mistake, bringing me here, that hospitals keep records, that doctors ask questions, that this would be his undoing if I was brave enough to survive and be the architect of my own resurrection. I woke to the sound of machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic, and for a moment I didn't remember where I was or what had happened. But then the pain crashed over me like a wave, and I remembered everything, and I tried to move, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and distant. And there was a woman sitting beside my bed. Not Marcus, but a woman in a white coat with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a bun, and she smiled when she saw I was awake and introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, the surgeon who had saved my life. And she told me that I had been lucky, that the internal bleeding had been severe, that another hour and I wouldn't have made it. And I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. And she held up a hand and said I should rest, that we would talk later. But there was something in her expression, something that made me think she knew more than she was saying. And over the next 3 days, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I became aware of things, whispered conversations between nurses, pointed looks from staff members, the way Dr. Chen would come to check on me when Marcus wasn't there, and ask me questions that seemed casual, but weren't. Questions about how I got my injuries, about whether I felt safe at home, about whether there was anyone I wanted to call. And I wanted to trust her, wanted to tell her everything, but fear had been my companion for so long that I couldn't form the words, couldn't risk what Marcus would do if he found out I had talked. And he was there every day, sitting in the chair by my bed, scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to smile at nurses and maintain his performance. But when we were alone, his eyes were cold and threatening, and he would lean close and remind me of what would happen if I betrayed him. And I nodded, because what else could I do, trapped in this broken body in this hospital bed with nowhere to run? And then on the 4th day, something changed. Dr. Chen came in with a police detective, a woman named Rodriguez with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. And Marcus was at lunch in the cafeteria, and Dr. Chen closed the door and sat down, and told me that they knew that the injuries I sustained were not consistent with a fall downstairs, that the pattern of bruising, the fractures, the internal damage all pointed to sustained physical assault. And Detective Rodriguez said they had been building a case, that 3 other women had come forward with complaints about Marcus from before we were married. Women he had dated, women who had filed restraining orders that had mysteriously been dropped. And I felt something crack open inside me, some dam that had been holding back years of terror and shame. And I started crying, and once I started, I couldn't stop. And Dr. Chen held my hand while I told them everything, 5 years of horror spilling out in a flood of words and tears. And Detective Rodriguez recorded it all and told me I was brave, that I was doing the right thing, that they would protect me. And I wanted to believe her, but I knew Marcus. I knew what he was capable of. And I asked what would happen next. And she said they would arrest him, that they had enough evidence now, with my testimony, to charge him with multiple felonies. And I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror, because I knew this would enrage him, would make him more dangerous than ever. And as if summoned by my thoughts, the door opened and Marcus walked in, holding a cup of coffee. And he saw Dr. Chen and Detective Rodriguez, and his expression flickered for just a second, revealing the monster beneath, before he rearranged his features into confusion and concern, and asked what was going on. And Detective Rodriguez stood and identified herself and told him he was under arrest for aggravated assault, domestic violence, and attempted murder. And I watched his face as the words hit him, watched him try to maintain his composure, try to laugh it off as some kind of mistake. But the detective was already reading him his rights, and 2 uniformed officers appeared in the doorway. And I saw something I had never seen before. I saw fear in Marcus's eyes, real, genuine fear. And he looked at me, and for a moment I thought he might lunge at me, might try to finish what he started. But the officers were already restraining him, already leading him away. And he was shouting now, telling them I was lying, that I was mentally unstable, that I had hurt myself for attention. And his voice faded down the hallway. And I was shaking so hard the monitors started beeping in alarm. And Dr. Chen was there, talking to me in soothing tones, telling me I was safe, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. But I knew better. I knew that men like Marcus didn't give up, didn't accept defeat, that he would find a way to get to me. And the days that followed were a blur of police interviews and lawyers and victim advocates. And I learned that Marcus had been arrested before, that he had a juvenile record that had been sealed, that there were other women besides the 3 who had come forward, women who had been too afraid to speak up. And I realized I had never really known him at all, that the man I married was a carefully constructed facade, hiding something much darker. And Detective Rodriguez told me that they had searched our house, had found evidence that Marcus had been planning something, had been researching ways to kill someone and make it look like an accident. And I felt bile rise in my throat, understanding how close I had come to becoming a statistic, another dead wife, another tragedy. And 2 weeks after my surgery, I was released from the hospital and moved into a safe house, a nondescript apartment in an undisclosed location with security and counseling and other women who understood what I had been through. And for the first time in 5 years, I could breathe without fear, could sleep without wondering if I would wake up to his hands around my throat. And I started therapy, started the long, painful process of unpacking the trauma, of rebuilding myself from the ruins he had left behind. And I learned that I had been experiencing something called complex PTSD, that my brain had been rewired, that healing would take time but was possible. And slowly, very slowly, I began to remember who I was before Marcus. The trial began 6 months later, and I sat in that courtroom and faced him for the first time since his arrest. And he looked different, smaller somehow, diminished in his orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the same cruel calculation, the same violence barely contained. And I forced myself not to look away, forced myself to remember why I was here. And the prosecutor was a fierce woman named Amanda Thornton, who had built her career on putting away domestic abusers. And she told the jury my story, showed them photographs of my injuries, medical records, police reports, and one by one, the other women testified, Marcus's ex-girlfriends, who described similar patterns of abuse, manipulation, control, violence. And I watched the jury's faces, saw their expressions shift from neutral to horrified. And when it was my turn to testify, I walked to that stand on legs that trembled but held, and I looked at the jury, not at Marcus, and I told them everything. And Amanda asked me why I stayed, why I didn't leave sooner, and I explained what anyone who has never been abused cannot understand, that leaving is the most dangerous time, that he had isolated me, systematically destroyed my support system, my confidence, my sense of self, that he had made me believe I deserved the abuse, that no one would believe me, that I had nowhere to go. And I saw some of the jurors nodding, saw tears in their eyes. And Marcus's lawyer tried to discredit me, tried to paint me as vindictive, as a liar, as mentally unstable. But Amanda objected at every turn, protected me. And then came the bombshell, the evidence that changed everything. Detective Rodriguez testified about what they found in Marcus's computer search histories for untraceable poisons, for how to stage accidents, for how long it takes someone to die from internal bleeding. And the prosecution's digital forensics expert revealed that Marcus had been planning my murder for months, had been researching, had been preparing. And the most chilling piece of evidence was a life insurance policy Marcus had taken out on me just 3 months before the final beating, a policy worth $2 million that he had never told me about. And suddenly his decision to take me to the hospital that night made horrifying sense. He couldn't kill me at home anymore because the investigation had already started, because the other women had come forward, because the walls were closing in, and he needed my death to look natural, to look like complications from an accident, and the hospital was the perfect cover. And I sat there listening to this revelation, feeling cold all over, understanding that the woman I had seen in the operating room, the one who told me to fight, might have saved my life in more ways than one. Because if I had died on that table, Marcus would have walked away free with $2 million, and no one would have questioned it. And the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. And I watched as Marcus was led away, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt something like peace. And the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life and told him that men who abuse women are cowards who deserve no mercy. And I walked out of that courtroom into the sunshine, and I could breathe fully, deeply, without pain. And Detective Rodriguez told me I had been incredibly brave, that my testimony had helped convict a dangerous man. And Dr. Chen, who had attended the trial, hugged me and told me she was proud of me. And I realized that I had been wrong about being alone, that there were people who had fought for me, who had believed me, who had helped me survive. And in the months that followed, I began to truly heal. I went back to school, finished my nursing degree, and I specialized in emergency medicine because I wanted to be the person who could see what others missed, who could ask the right questions, who could save women like me. And I volunteered at domestic violence shelters, shared my story, helped other women find the courage to leave, to speak up, to survive. And I learned that revenge isn't about violence or hatred. Revenge is living well, is taking back your power, is refusing to let your abuser define you. And 3 years after the trial, I was working a night shift in the ER when they brought in a young woman unconscious, beaten badly, and her husband was with her, playing the concerned spouse. And I saw the signs immediately, the pattern of injuries, the fear in her eyes when she briefly woke, the possessive way he touched her. And I thought of that moment in the operating room, the choice I had been given, to let go or to fight. And I knew what I had to do. And I pulled Detective Rodriguez's card from my wallet. She had given it to me years ago, told me to call if I ever needed anything. And I stepped into the hallway and made the call and told her what I suspected. And she said she would be there in 20 minutes. And I went back to that young woman and I leaned close and I whispered the same words that had been whispered to me, that she had a choice, that there was power in survival, that this could be his undoing if she was brave enough. And when Detective Rodriguez arrived, I made sure she had everything she needed to start building a case. And as I watched that woman being wheeled to surgery, I thought about the strange woman I had seen years ago, the one who seemed almost supernatural. And I wondered if she had been real, or if she had been my own subconscious refusing to give up. And I decided it didn't matter, because whether she was an angel or a hallucination or simply the part of me that refused to die, she had been right. And I was living proof that survival is the greatest revenge, that speaking truth to power changes everything, that broken things can be mended, and that sometimes the woman who nearly dies becomes the one who saves lives. And I smiled because I knew that young woman in surgery had a chance now, had people who would fight for her, just as people had fought for me. And the cycle of violence that had nearly killed me was being broken one survivor at a time.